Hello everyone, it's Matt McLachlan, publisher of Peter Hart's Military History, and I hope you're really enjoying the podcast series as much as I am. I love hearing from Peter and Gary every week with their thoughts about these amazing chapters of military history. This is just a quick announcement that there is something exciting coming up. Peter Hart's next book will be published by us, by Living History. Peter and I have come together and we're publishing a new book which will be out later in the year, and it's all about, drumroll please, the Gallipoli Evacuation. That's right, how the Allies left Gallipoli at the end of the campaign. It's one of the most important chapters of the entire story, yet it's one of the most overlooked. But that's all about to change. No one has done as much work on this as Peter Hart has done for this book, and it's going to be really quite wonderful. So he's going to tell the whole story of the evacuation, the fears that they were going to lose 50% or 75% of the men trying to get off, that the Turks would break through and push the Allies into the sea as they were scrambling to get onto their boats, the politicians dithering about whether they should stay or whether they should leave, the diversionary attacks to draw attention away from the evacuations, and of course what the men were going through as they had to abandon their trenches, abandon their dead comrades, and leave Gallipoli forever. It's going to be just such a wonderful, wonderful book. And Peter tells the full story of the evacuation, all those details I've just described. But of course, as a wonderful oral historian, Peter, over the years, spoke to many of the veterans who went through this themselves. And so the book is full of first-hand accounts, and really the evacuation is told from the perspective of the men themselves. So it's going to be out in September 2020, but we are doing a pre-sale which will start in about June and carry on for the next couple of months. And if you order the book during the pre-sale, you'll get a very special bonus from Peter Hart, which we will announce in the coming weeks. So look out for that, the book by Peter Hart, The Gallipoli Evacuation. It's really going to be something special.
A Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History.
Hello, and welcome to Peter Hart's Military History with myself. My name's Peter Hart, and Gary Bain, who is speaking to me from far off Tottenham.
Well, Peter.
Home of Tottenham Hotspur, your favourite football club, mate.
Yes, Peter. The in-joke there, it's that I'm an Arsenal fan, listeners.
They're all the same, really, if you think about it. Anyway.
I've got a special ode to Toilette on for you today. Essence of Fred.
Essence of Fred. Dog's been farty, does he?
Yes.
What a cracking dog that is. He brings light into our lives, as long as you're not in the same room. Well, today, what we're doing today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about an individual veteran from the First World War. Now, this veteran was called Montagu Cleeve. Now, you're going, who the hell's that? Well, the answer is he's just a soldier, isn't he? And before we go on, I want to say I didn't do this interview, but I've always been fascinated by Cleeve. And this interview was done by my colleague, Lynn Smith, of the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive. She did it back in the 1980s. She was a freelancer for us, and she was a wonderful lady. She had a wonderful, fab, posh voice as well, as, of course, does Montagu Cleeve. Perhaps it's as well that she interviewed him and not me, eh? You can hear the whole interview if you go to the Imperial War Museum website, or just type Montagu Cleeve, Cleeve, into the internet, and IWM, and it'll come out. Anyway, who was he? Who was this masked man, Gary? Do you know?
Not at all. I'm completely in your hands today, and I'm very slightly nervous.
Yes. As well you might be. Well, Montagu Cleeve was born in Southsea, i.e. Portsmouth, on the 20th of October, 1894. So he's older than us, Gary, older than us. He's the son of an officer in the Royal Engineers, and there'd never been a lot of doubt about his career. Here's a quote. We're going to play some quotes from Cleeve later, but we'll read most of them because it's easier. I don't want too much work for poor old Matt McLachlan. Oh, McLachlan. Well, never mind. I'm sure he knows his own name. Anyway, this is a quote from Cleeve. He goes, "It became the custom in the family for all fit males to go into either the army or the navy as a tradition. My brother's eyes weren't quite good enough for that, so he couldn't go, and I went automatically. No questions about my future from the day I was born." Were you like that when you were born, Gary?
There was absolutely no doubt about mine. I was going in the Navy. That's why I joined the Army at 16. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, socially, and again, you're going to correct me because I may well be wrong here, but in the, shall we say, the middle to upper classes, weren't there, for want of a better word, careers allocated to the children? So, you know, the slightly less academically achieving went into the religious calling, I understand, and the army. And so was that not the norm at the time?
Norm's going too strong, probably, but it's certainly very common. You hear it quite a lot, and certainly in the aristocracy or the middle classes, where there just isn't enough. There just isn't enough money to go around. Gary's just making a very strange gesture at me. I don't know what that means. I'll think about something else. And Montagu Cleeve wasn't upper class and barely middle class in many ways. He sounds posh to us, as you'll hear, because of his accent. Anyway, what about him? Well, his mother was a very skillful pianist and an artist, and she had a big influence on Cleeve. He studied both piano and violin. He was edited. Wish I'd been edited instead of educated. I'd have done a lot better, I feel. They could have edited my personality to be a nicer one. Anyway, he was educated at Rugby Preparatory School and then sent off to Dean Close School in Cheltenham. These are posh boarding schools. It means it's this thing of the middle classes and upper classes of sending your little boy, or mainly little boy, off to school away from the family at about 6 or 7. And as I go through life with my family, and I know that you must feel this with your beloved John, it would be great to send them off about 7 and only see him twice a year, wouldn't it?
Well, I only see him about twice a year anyway, because that's the only time he gets up.
Anyway, he said this about his time in Cheltenham. He said, "I learned to mix with other people, made a lot of very good friends, nearly all of whom were killed in World War One." And that's a dark element. At school, he was a member of the Officers' Training Corps and rose to the dizzy heights of Lance Corporal. Now, you've got something to say about that, haven't you? I mean, you've got something in common with Cleeve, haven't you?
Yeah, I rose to the dizzy heights of Lance Corporal several times.
Several times, Gary.
Yeah.
Not just once.
No, move on.
All right. And he passed his Certificate A, and this is a sort of qualification, you know, if there was a war, you'd be Certificate A. You were entitled to be an officer, and also, you know, consideration for a commission anyway. He left school in 1912, and he was supposed to go to the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, but he had terrible difficulty in passing the entrance exams. Now, we're going to have a reading from, not from Cleeve himself, because you're going to hear there's a difference in voices. Gary, your voice isn't quite the same as Cleve's, is it?
No, I think when we hear him later, actually, you'll realise what a fantastic impressionist I am.
Okay, so here's your impression of Montagu Cleeve.
History was one of the subjects, and I was absolutely abominable at history.
Sorry,
so,
Carthy, why am I laughing?
You're a historian. So much so that the most I ever got an exam in history was 5 out of 100. My parents were in despair because I twice took the entrance to Woolwich and failed because of my history. Then my mother hit on a brainwave. She knew that all Cleeves have a terrific sense of humour, so she presented me with Heath Robinson's Monarchs of Merry England, which is a history in rhyme of English history and illustrated most amusingly. I learned that by heart, and at my final entry exam, because I was getting beyond the age limit, I passed with 15 out of 100 and got into the shop in the autumn of 1913. 15 out of 100.
I love that. Mind you, it's Heath Robinson's Monarchs of Merry England. It's hardly the sort of history textbook I would have recommended, but there you go. Funnily enough, it does work sometimes, because I knew I was once getting extremely bored of writing a book on the First World War aviation, and I read Biggles, Flies Undone or something. It wasn't Biggles Takes It Rough. That is my all-time Biggles novel. And if you don't believe there's such a novel, Biggles takes it rough. Have a look. But I read the Biggles First World War ones, and it really encouraged me and brought it to life. So I do understand what Cleeve means a bit. Luckily, he was much better at maths and science. And sometimes people speculate as to whether there are different sorts of brains. Not very good brains like ours, Gary, and then there's brains that are very good at history, and then there's brains that are very good at maths and sciences. Now, maths and science doesn't go too well with history, I would say. Anyway, he was good at them, and he started at Woolwich in January 1914. He went to the Royal Artillery because he still wasn't good enough to go into the Royal Engineers. He just was not good enough in his history exam. And he went for the Royal Garrison Artillery, which are the people who run, they then ran, I think they ran the Coastal Artillery, and they ran the very big guns, big bangy things is a technical term that we often use. He also, the Royal Garrison Artillery is not a rich unit. The Royal Horse Artillery and people like that are what you would call knobs, Gary, and they didn't have to live on their army salary. Whereas Cleeve was not rich. He was well off compared to the working class man, but he wasn't rich. And yes,
so what you're basically saying, he had to live off of his army salary. He wasn't a man of independent means. And one of the questions in my mind is, what sort of expenses could a newly commissioned subaltern have expected in 1914?
Well, there's quite a lot. I mean, for a start, the grant you get never seems to cover the uniform and equipment you need. And the British Army officer in peacetime has equipment for everything. You know, I mean, if you want to run a polo horse, I mean, some regiments have ran polo. You know, you have polo. That means you have to have a horse, and that's not. You know, a horse isn't like. Well, it is a bit like a dog. It's an animal, but it's. You know, you have to stable it. So you've got your polo horse. You've got all the different uniforms. The mess dress is expensive. The grants don't cover it all. You've got your wash stand and everything. All the other equipment that they took away when they went on tour, I was going to say, but.
And of course, you got the mess fees, which I understand were shared. So you might have had some wealthy people in the mess drinking themselves silly, shall we say? And you're trying to be frugal, but you've got to pay for everybody.
It's a shared mess bills, and mess bills can be a big thing. Some people's mess bills were in fashionable units were more than just the mess bills alone were more than the salary. So he was being careful. So he went into the Royal Garrison Artillery. Now, the war breaks out in August 1914. I think we probably agree on that. And he was still a cadet at Woolwich. But his intake were commissioned as second lieutenants after only 2 terms. So he was commissioned on the 16th of November 1914. This is early commissioning. And I find this quite interesting because at the moment, in this pandemic at the moment, those doctors, the new generation of doctors are being brought through early so they can help. For which we thank them, but it's a tremendous what their parents must be thinking. But never mind what Cleeve's parents must have been thinking, because he goes off to war in essence, only part trained on the 16th of November 1914, and his first posting is to me fascinating, and we've seen it, Gary, when we had that Historians Do Drink. Fine body of men and women, which you can join on the internet if you want, ladies and gentlemen. It's free. You have to answer the questions, and they're very difficult. And we went to Portsmouth to visit the museums there. And while we were there, you could see a big thingy, couldn't we? Remember that big thingy out in the Straits, in the Solent? And that was one of Palmerston's follies. And Cleeve was sent to No Man's Land Fort, which was built in the 1860s. Oh, God, I should have looked that up, shouldn't I? But anyway, 1860s. You're right. Yeah. 18, and they look fantastic, don't they? I mean, some of them are hotels and things now, and they've got sort of gigantic sort of granite walls that you know, and then above them there's a sort of railway line, little tiny railway line going around in circles to take the ammunition. Well, it says a dozen. I'm not sure. I think I got that off Cleeve. There's several I would go for 12-inch breech-loading rifled guns pointing out of these sort of porthole affairs. And Cleeve was the officer of the watch, and he was responsible for the guns and for, if a ship came in, he would fire a warning shot. Now, here's a tape recording of him made by Lynn Smith back in the 1980s.
We had one gun manned all the time. That was called the examination gun, and that had to be prepared to fire if a ship came in which didn't respond to the pass signal, whatever it was. We were very naughty because we had control of the searchlights, and normally they were doused and nobody could see anything. Then at surprise moments we had a lever and we had to switch, open the covers, and suddenly the whole of the scene was lit up with searchlights, and we'd see a periscope of a submarine fire, and the gun went straight off this periscope. It was only a bit of flotsam or something like that, but we imagined it was absolutely wicked, but it was great fun. For on one occasion, I was on duty, and a ship, a small vessel, did come in and didn't respond to the pass sign, whatever the flag, whatever it was, and it was given 2 chances. It didn't respond, so I gave the order to fire, of course, just in front of the vessel. It stopped immediately, and later on I was rung up for one of the other forts, and they were furious because they said one of my shell splinters had landed on the ship. I didn't care 2 hoots. I was doing my duty.
Now, I think that's a great story. I think, just the way he tells it, and his voice is so different from yours, Gary. You said you were doing.
Yeah, I mean, forgive the parlance, but he doesn't sound very butch, very manly, does he?
No. But not all soldiers are. Talking of impressions, could you do your impression of the Duke of Westminster?
Hello, I am the Duke of Westminster.
That is absolutely incredibly spot on. If the Duke of Westminster listens to this,
which he obviously does.
Yeah, well, most people are listening to it. Anyway, so we carry on. In March 1915, he's been through his course, and he's learned all his gunnery. So he's learned all his gunnery, and now he's had practical experience. Practical experience at Fort No Man's Land. Sorry, I might not have said that. Fort No Man's Land was the name of the Palmerston Folly he was on. And in March 1915, he gets a posting to the 36th Siege Battery, Royal Garrison Artillery, who at the time are just in Taunton. And they were a 4-gun heavy battery, and they're equipped with some brand new Back to the Future guns, and these are 8-inch Mark I howitzers. And these guns are really strange. And when they went out to France in late September 1915, they caused a lot of attention. Everyone's going. Now, why do they cause a lot of attention? Well, that's because these guns aren't what they seem. And here's Montagu Cleeve again with the second extract we're playing today to tell you why these guns are unusual.
They were very improvised howitzers because they were old, I think 6-inch Mark I's or something, cut in half, and the front half was thrown away, and the rest of it was brought out to 8 inches with rifling, and they were given modern breech mechanisms, and they were mounted on enormous tractor wheels, commercial tractor wheels like the steamrollers had that used to repair roads as they were available. And they were monstrous things and extremely heavy, but the machinery of the guns was very simple, and that's why they did so extremely well and didn't give nearly as much trouble as some of the more complicated guns that gradually came to appear later on. One of them we had was the very first one to be made, and it was marked 8-inch howitzer number 1 Mark I. So we call that gun the original, and if it appears on photographs, which I think it does occasionally, as you'll see the original painted on it, and that was the first one to be made. and it fired marvellously accurately.
So that's that. So that's the original, the original, and you see it sometimes in photographs. If you go on the internet, there are pictures of the original. This sort of massive 8-inch. It's an emergency measure, isn't it, Gary? Because we haven't got the right guns. When the war started in 1914, we had this idea that what you needed was quick firing. Heavier than we had in the Boer War, so 13 pounders then, 15 pounders, 13, I think. Anyway, whatever. We decided to go for 18 pounders. But when we got to trench warfare, there's a real need for heavier guns, desperate need for heavier guns. Now, they were monstrous beasts, they really were. And here's a quote that I'm going to read in my Montagu Cleeve accent, which is just as bad as Gary's. Apparently he's not from Chesterfield either. Here we go.
Luton.
They were unnecessarily heavy for their size, and you couldn't turn the gun round in a road. You really wanted the length of a tennis court to describe a circle in it. They had to have a wooden platform put down over the rather soft earth to strengthen the surface from which they had to fire. Then they had these huge wooden chocks which we put in to jam the wheels, hoping that they wouldn't move. But they always did, of course, because they took half the recoil. Half the recoil was taken by the buffer and half the movement by the movement of the gun. So that when the gun was fired, it would move back and then have to be repositioned. So he says the wheels used to ride back right up to the top of the chocks, and then the curvature of the chocks made them go back forwards again by gravity. If the chocks weren't put in quite the right position, the guns went back, got completely off the line, and was slewed round. One of the skills which we developed was purely due to the men who were a splendid lot of Durham miners. They used to get so good at placing the chocks that we could fire quite rapidly, knowing the gun would recoil back only a fraction of a degree off the line to the target. So the guns would run back up the chock and then roll back and be in almost exactly the same position.
The easy way to think about that is the energy's got to go somewhere. So the gun is actually forced back. And if you look on the internet, you can see film of this from the Great War, and you can see these huge guns being forced backwards and then rolling back into position. And you can actually find that on the internet quite easily.
Brilliant. Now, the big crews, so there's a crew of 10. So you've got the sergeant, the gun sergeant, the number one. He's really in charge of the gun, whatever officers may say. You've got the gun layer, you've got breech operators, and then you've got ammunition numbers, the rest of them. And they've got a bloody tough time because these shells are flaming heavy. Why didn't I look up how heavy the shell are? Why, Gary?
Well, they are very heavy. And if you think about it, just think about that for a minute. We're not talking about any of the battles yet, but think about, for example, the bombardment before the Battle of the Somme. A week-long bombardment, and your job is to feed this monster with these huge shells.
Well, so there we go. Now, so they move the urgency. Why they got these strange adapted guns in the first place was because they were getting ready for the Battle of the Somme, and they moved to Beaumet as part of the build-up. And Cleeve talks about just what a job it was, just getting them in the right place. And also, this has got one of my favourite stupid anecdotes in. I do like this quote. I hope you enjoy it.
But the digging we had to do to get into that gun position, 10 feet deep and about 40 feet in length, was simply gigantic. But it was very well, and we camouflaged it extremely well by putting wire netting over it, threaded with real grass, I think it was. And we had an awful job to manoeuvre the guns into it, because the caterpillars were useless. They could get them into the neighbourhood of the guns, but then we had to manhandle these enormous monsters, I forget what they weighed, several tons, we had to push them. Couldn't pull them, we had to push them into their positions. But when they were there, they were very well concealed, so much so a French farmer with his cow, walked straight into the net, and both fell in. And we had a most appalling job getting this beastly cow out of the gun position. The man came out all right. But the cow, however, it was enormous fun.
So I love the idea. I just love the idea of his farmer and his stupid cow. Or was it the cow and the stupid farmer? Because I've seen pictures of these gun pits. How he missed them, I've no idea. Camouflaged or not. The bloke must have been. I wonder if he'd been drinking. The drink does strange things to you, Gary. Have you noticed that?
Perhaps he was just the milkman, and it's the early morning delivery. It's quite interesting, though, Peter, that a local farmer is in the battle area.
Well, they're fair bit behind the line. Yeah. Now, where were they? Well, they were quite far back, and this is Cleeve talking about where their billets were. He said, "We officers were living in a marvellous chateau, which was filled with furniture, and I remember my delight at finding a newish violin, which I was able to play. That was a great joy to me, because I hadn't touched a violin for so long. We were absolutely in the lap of luxury. This was only a few hundred yards from the gun position. And now his men would not be living in quite such comfortable circumstances. And that's worth remembering."
And one of the things that strikes me is, the owner of the chateau, did they simply take accommodation and things that they needed, or, was there payments made to the locals for the use of their accommodation?
No, I'm going to have to be absolutely honest and say I don't know. It's fine. I love these because Gary does work on this and prepares questions that he knows I won't know the answer to. In some cases, they just left it. In some cases, they were still living there, but I don't know in this particular case. I'll be honest with you. I love the idea of him playing the violin. I also can imagine the less cultured, think of yourself, Gary, members of that officers' mess going, "I wish he'd stop playing that effing violin."
That would never pass my lips. Beautiful.
I'm not going to play Beethoven's violin sonata in D flat.
Well, I hope you get lots of complaints about that.
Well, I'm sure no one would ever complain. Now, here's a quote. They then move from there to the open fields near Engel-Belmer. And they're absolute. This is getting ready for the big offensive. And the fields around are full of batteries of guns. There's 15 Royal Naval Division, Royal Marine Artillery battery. There's all sorts of things. The barrage for the Somme, the Battle of the Somme doesn't start on the 1st of July. It starts, for the Air Force, it starts months before. It starts at least a week beforehand with a bombardment. And he says this, the bombardment, which took place for a whole week beforehand, with every gun on both sides firing tooth and nail. It was a terrible din going on. You could hardly hear yourself talk, and dangerous. During the bombardment, there was a gigantic explosion because a 15-inch howitzer only 100 yards in front of the battery had blown up. All the splinters in the earth came showering down on us, and for some miraculous reason we escaped. But they had some men killed and several maimed, and that's a worthwhile point. They're firing the 15-inch battery was the Royal Marine Artillery one, and there was a big scandal and an investigation as to why it had blown up. But you sometimes wonder, they're firing a gun that's been rebored out. You sometimes wonder about margins for safety with this sort of thing. But that's the speculation of a historian and not someone who knows anything about what they're talking about in this particular instance. And then they move on to some more gun pits in Alba itself, the town of Alba, which I'm sure.
Before you go on, Peter, can I just ask a question? In one of our other podcasts, the Second War, we talk about the South Notts Hussars and people going into the artillery because it was perceived to be safer than the infantry. Was that the case in the First World War? Was it safer being in the artillery, or was it equally dangerous?
I think there's an old saying that if you're in the artillery, you wouldn't fancy being in the infantry. Being in the front line trenches and the mud and the blood and the occasional, and they are very occasional, going over the top. But the reverse is true. The infantry often didn't fancy being in the artillery because the artillery are much more in the open, in a sense, and also they get the attentions of counter-battery fire, so they get these big, huge shells crashing down on them if their position is located. So, later on when tanks are added to the mix, you find the same thing with tank men. They wouldn't want to be infantry, but infantry wouldn't want to be in a tank and attracting the attentions of other tanks and artillery. So it's sort of, everybody's got their own trade and they sort of put up with it. But it is dangerous. It is dangerous. So they moved to Alba. Now, here's the last of our quotes from Cleeve, and this is of a terrible experience he had whilst going forward to the forward observation post. This isn't funny.
We literally couldn't walk along the trenches without treading on dead bodies, German and British, and the stench on those hot summer days and the flies was simply appalling. That was one of the most miserable memories that I have of the Somme. It was pathetic, really. But we had to not to mind, and eventually one just got over it and thought nothing of it. And there were dead bodies all around, all over the place, and we couldn't help it. We were alive, and that's what mattered. And being alive, we had jolly well had to get on with it, and that's exactly what we did.
So that's the fourth quote and last quote from Cleeve. Now, here's a quote that sort of goes with it that I'll read. Cleeve, it's talking about how he felt, because it must, Cleeve is not a rough, tough, hairy-arsed soldier. And he says, I think I'm a very nervous person. I'm terribly nervous when I get onto a concert platform until I settle down to it. Then I enjoy it. I think I was nervous when I first heard the shells in the bombardment on the Somme, but I made a deliberate point of overcoming my nerves. I think I succeeded in doing it. When I first experienced those dead bodies I had to walk over, after that, I overcame all fear, and I braved the very nasty situations that I had to face, because I jolly well knew there was a job to be done. And I knew we all intended in our battery to do our very best. When we had that spirit, it overcame all fear. And I think, perhaps we talk about this a minute, it's often this with morale, with personal courage. It's not just you. There's more than one involved in a way, isn't there, Gary?
Yeah, and it's also interesting people's different views when they first encounter dead bodies. We've got some interesting podcasts where we talk about the types of corpses that you come across in Gallipoli, for example, with the conditions and dysentery and all the rest of it. But, this is quite evocative. He's actually talking about walking over dead people, and it's really, really shocking that the human mind can just accept that because of the circumstances that he finds himself in.
And I find it interesting that he reaches for the comradeship of the men in the battery. He doesn't try and do it on his own, and people often, they get through it how they can. Some men can do it on their own, and some people reach for comradeship to sort of bind them together. And this is the thing of, are you scared? Of course I'm not scared. And you sort of jolly yourselves along together. There's one man he remembered in particular. Should I read I'll read this next quote now, I think. And this is a similar time, not the same time, but a similar time. And Cleeve said, I remember particularly a sergeant. He was lying on the ground and dead. And he had his hand on his Bible open. And I knew it was a Douai Bible. Douai? Yeah. And from that, I knew he was a Catholic. I took his address from that Bible. The shrapnel pouring over our heads. It didn't matter. And I closed his eyes and closed the book and put that in my pocket. And then I crawled back to the front line. I sent that Bible home to his widow. When I went home and described it to my mother, she's an artist, and she said, I'd like to paint a picture of that. There were some troops billeted on Wimbledon Common. So she somehow got hold of a sergeant. Draw a veil over that, I think. And he very kindly posed for her. I had to put him in the exact position that I found that sergeant. She drew a most marvellous portrait of the ground which I described to her and the shell burst, and obviously this sergeant that was posing in the position. Now, that's when Cleeve was wounded later and he came back home. But it shows this is not a normal family in the sense of your family or my family, my family were cultural deserts. Not the current, not my children. They're incredibly artistic and talented. And my wife is there.
Mine was Scottish.
Yes. Oh well. So, yes.
Now that was in support of the attacks at Moray Farm, wasn't it? And I've seen some pictures of the devastation there, and our mutual friend Major Chris Carney describes it as being malleted. And You know, it is absolutely destroyed, isn't it, Luke Farm?
Well, I'm hoping that Matt will put a picture up at some point, or we'll find one and stick it underneath the posting of it, so you can get an idea just what these shells are doing to the ground. The battery are lucky, aren't they, Gary? Because they don't suffer many casualties at first.
No, so they suffered their first casualty on the 20th of October. And if I may, I'll do the quote for this one, Peter. It was a very nice young chap called Gunner Jap. We were being shelled and we were going on firing anyway. We didn't notice it, but he was lying on the ground and we thought he'd fallen asleep or something. And we went to him and there was not a sign of anything wrong. And then we opened his tunic and found a tiny little splinter had gone right through his heart. And that was our one and only casualty in the whole of the Somme. Now that casualty was Gunner Alexander Jap, who was from Kelty in Fife, and he'd buried at the Albert Communal Cemetery extension. So Cleeve grew to have a really high regard for his gunners, and he goes on to say, they were marvellous. I don't honestly think we could have had a better group of men than those Durham miners. We think of miners now striking and wanting more pay and that sort of thing. Bearing in mind when this quote is from, there was no suggestion of it with them. They were all volunteers, every one of them. They weren't called up. The battery really consisted mostly of regular soldiers, most of whom became NCOs, and these wonderful Durham miners. They just sprang to it whenever they knew there was a job to be done. They were such a pleasant lot to work with. I think that helped us enormously to be such a good battery. We couldn't have been a good battery with men who were only half-hearted or wore their hearts on their sleeves, but these were wholeheartedly good chaps. It was such a pleasure to work with them.
I think that's a marvellous testimony to the men of Durham there. I hope anybody from Durham listening to it would be proud of them. The one thing about the casualties is the reason they only had one casualty is that their positions weren't spotted. So perhaps the camouflage was good, or perhaps they were lucky, because if they had been spotted and they'd been targeted by counter-battery fire, they'd have had a lot more casualties. But they were, in that sense, lucky at that time. There was one thing, that because Cleeve was a musician, and this is a good story, because I told you that at times they were in fields with lots of guns, and he'd been to the mess or something, and he was walking back, and this happened. It was a howitzer that gave me my gun deafness in my left ear, because I was coming back from an OP. I misled you there. Coming back from an observation post by night on the Somme. It was a very dark night, pitch dark, and I couldn't see a thing except the occasional flash of a gun or a shell burst. I was groping my way to try and find the battery position because my relief had taken over from me. And to my horror, a 9.2 howitzer went bang straight off in my left ear. Then I discovered I couldn't see it. It was only 10 yards away, and that deafened the ear permanently, more or less. But it's got worse in recent years. I wonder whether that was a 9.2. It's a big gun anyway. Now, he got some promotion. Wartime brings quick promotion. He was an acting captain by the time they moved to Bahrain, and they're preparing for the Battle of Arras. That would commence on the 9th of April, obviously, which was, quite recently from the time when we are actually recording this. Suddenly they come under, they're moving, in Bahrain, and they're moving through that, and there's a heavy German barrage, and it hits this convoy of ammunition lorries. And what happens when you hit a convoy of ammunition lorries?
Well, usually big bangy things everywhere.
Yes, bang, bang, bangity bang. And that, in turn, detonates the ammunition dump. Now, this is a really, really big explosive thing. So you're going to read this quote to us. It's quite exciting.
Yep. So somebody told us there was a good cellar in the town hall. We ran like hares across the square and dived down into the cellar to find it already occupied by about 40 infantry. It only had a tiny little vent hole, about a foot square, facing south, and that was all the air that we could get. The town hall had been hit over our heads and was blazing. I knew that if we stayed there, we would probably be suffocated. I climbed the staircase and the whole place in ruins already, blazing around me. I was just going across what remained of the hall and I got hit in my left eye and another in my thigh. I crawled down to the basement. I yelled out to the men, for God's sake, run for your lives. If you don't, you'll get suffocated. and they took my advice and they all scampered out.
Now that's quite exciting. That was the end of his time on the Western Front for a while. What he means is the air would be sucked out of the cellar, this is evocative of things like Dresden on a much smaller scale. But this is what happens to people in firestorms. Now, Cleeve gets carried out by one of his fellow officers, and the whole village is a blazing inferno. And he gets another shell splinter wound in the right arm, and that probably does for him. He's evacuated by ambulance and back in stages, usual stages, evacuated back to England. And that's him done for quite, December 1917. He's just about better. And he's promoted to acting major at this time. That's not bad promotion. Now, how many years were you in the army?
Roughly 7 years, I think.
And you went from private to what was it when you finished?
Private.
Well, as you'll notice, he's got in 1914. From 1914, he was a lieutenant, and now he's an acting major. Well, he's a major, And he's given a fantastic job because he goes on a battery commander's course at Larkhill, which is, I think, still the School of Artillery. Or am I just being old? It's certainly where the Artillery Museum is, the Royal Artillery Museum is. And then he gets a super interesting posting. And this is what really attracts us to the study of Cleeve, because it's just weird, the posting he gets. He seems to get interesting postings. First, Fort No Man's Land in the Solent, then he gets the original, the new 8-inch howitzers, and now he gets this. What is it he gets? Well, he's sent to 471 Siege Battery, and there it's a railway gun. And it's what are these railway guns? Well, the guns are 14-inch guns. At 14-inch guns that are from the partially completed Chilean dreadnought. We were building a dreadnought, the Almirante Cochrane, which we were building for Chile, and we decided we'd have it.
Why 14-inch, Peter? Because the Germans quite successfully deployed a high-velocity 12-inch gun. So why did we not do something similar?
Well, this is for the Chileans, Gary.
Okay.
Perhaps they fancied 14-inch. Our big gun of choice was a 15-inch, but then we dropped back to 14-inch in the interwar years, and the King George V and that kind of thing, they're 14-inch. We also had a lot of 13.5-inch guns in the First World War. So there's just a variety of calibers. Our best gun was a 15-inch gun. But anyway, they decided they didn't want this Chilean dreadnought, so that she was being converted to being an aircraft carrier. So you have these big guns free, and the gun weighs 270 tons, and it could fire a 3/4 of a ton shell some 20 miles. And can you just imagine 3/4 of a ton flying through the air to land on your nut? You're 20 miles away, and this thing whistles past and lands on your nut. This is a huge thing. The gun weighs 270 tons. So it's put on a railway carriage, a railway mounting, and it's named Boche Buster. And then the other one is named Scene Shifter. That was a twin. And they get to France in late May 1918. When they get there, he's based first in Savy, which and this is what Cleeve says. We got to Savy, a charming little village. We put Boche Buster, the fighting train as we called it, locomotive, gun, the magazine wagon behind it with 16 bins carrying 8 shells in each bin, the cartridge wagon, the command post wagon, the artificer's wagon, and then the guards van behind that. So that's the fighting train, And so that's choo-chooing up and down on the railway line. And he was keen. Cleeve was, he was completely caught up in it. He loved the whole idea of railway guns. And he realised, and they realised, that you'd have to fire the guns. You couldn't just fire them from a normal railway line. You had to have special curved spurs. So off the normal railway line, you'd build a curved spur which went round. And if you think, and this is what Cleeve said, all the sappers really had to do was to build a spur. which was a curved line going off the main line. And then the gun could fire in any position on that curve according to the azimuth at which it was required to shoot. I did want, I made it. Could you explain to me what an azimuth is, Gary?
Well, I think largely it comes down to the fact that the traverse on these guns was only 2 degrees in either direction. So you whilst it had a very high elevation, you had to move it around the spur so that you could actually target where you wanted to target.
But what's an azimuth?
I think that explains it.
You've turned into a politician. You're not answering my question. Right. Dear listeners, neither of us know what an azimuth is. And he goes on. So that's why railway guns really became quite the thing, says Cleeve. It was extremely clever of them to make this biggest gun of all, the most mobile of all the railway guns that we had, because all the other ones took 3 hours minimum to get into their positions, and they had to be anchored down and all sorts of things, which was awfully troublesome. Now, why would that be a problem? Well, why would it be a problem not being able to get away quickly, Gary?
Well, because once you fired it, I should imagine that the Germans would quite like to locate where you are. And if you're on a fixed line, it's relatively simple to locate you.
There was an enormous flash. If they're normally fired at night, and there was a simply enormous flash, which, by triangulation, which I do understand, 2 observers, one there and one there, they both get a line on the thing. Where those lines interconnect is where Boche Buster is.
Hang on, so you're a historian, and that's maths.
It's very, very simple maths. Swine. Right. So anyway, and he says Boche Buster, this is Cleeve again, Boche Buster got up sticks and away within 5 minutes of being shelled. That's what saved our heads many times. Now, their main... Sorry.
That is really quick. 5 minutes from firing to away.
Don't believe him for a minute, mate. I don't believe, but
that's very quick.
That's what he says, and I would never argue with Montagu Cleeve. Now, the main targets they used are interdiction targets in the sense that they're aiming at railway junctions and stations, and what they're trying to do is disrupt German troop movements during the Allied 100 Days Offensive. So this is basically from August on. Now, what's very interesting for me is, and we often talk about, is bombing any use in the First World War? And the answer is, not really. You say you've got a railway junction. Firstly, you can't carry a bomb load that'll do enough damage, can you? As compared to a bloody 14-inch shell whistling out of the air and crashing down, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then another ad infinitum. Compare that with, just 1 or 2 bombs. One usually, £100 bomb, £200 bomb, perhaps even 500. Just one, then definitely. And you drop them, and then what about hitting the target? Well, if you come low, you'll be shot down by the anti-aircraft defences. So you've got this target. Even if you hit it, what's the damage you're going to do? And most of all, even if you hit it and you blow up the railway track, it's not like, if the branch line to Tooting goes down, you were a TFL man. If a branch line goes down, when would it next open? Now? A year? 2 years' time? If at all. They might just close it.
Yeah, now.
Well, at the moment, not at all. But the point, that's the point. In those days, all they do is they slap all the rubble and shit all around, knock a house down, use it to fill up the hole, put a railway line across it, and then send the next train with an unpopular driver and across. Now, that's with bombing. But artillery, firstly, the shell's much bigger. If you can hit the target, you're going to damage it with a huge crater that is difficult to fill. And you can repeat it with, once you've hit it once, you can repeat it. Not exactly, because artillery is never precise, but more accurate than bombing. And you could smash an area like a railway junction or that kind of thing. So that's what's important about this, hitting railway junctions and stations. And this is what Cleeve says about the technicalities. Now, I don't understand. Now we join each other again, Gary, in not understanding any of this. We went to France on our own range tables, which were largely speculative because we assumed that the loss of muzzle velocity between each round would be. See, I can't even read it. After each round, we had to make a mini adjustment for that loss of range for the next round to be fired. When we had orders to proceed into action, we had several minutes in the command post wagon of knowing what the target was going to be and what the spur line was going to be. And the officers could get down to all the calculations so that we were ready to open fire the moment we arrived in action. Now, the funny thing about this whole thing is that normally you just have his word for it, or perhaps a couple of photographs. And there are lots of photographs of this on the internet. But in this case, they had a VIP visitor, and it was filmed. This is the 8th of August, just prior to the start of the 100 days. They had been firing before, I think, but you often see that this was the first shot, but I don't believe it was. And Cleeve was told there's going to be a very important visitor, and that he was to shoot from the Maril Spur at 14:30 on the 8th of August. Now, and they got everything right, and they were expecting, well, some army commander, perhaps Haig, some dignitary, some posh knob. And what happens, Gary? You tell us the whole story, and listeners, you can compare this because it was filmed because the visitor, and it was on the internet. Here we go, Gary.
A whole cloud of dust arrived as a motorcade arrived, and out of the first car stepped His Majesty King George V. I took him over to the gun, a very tense young officer. He was extraordinarily interested in the gun. He walked all over the mountain with me, asking all sorts of questions. Then he asked if he could see the gun loaded. Of course, we said, yes. It had to be loaded by 12 men, 6 either side of the rammer, and they had to squash up together at the far end of the platform. A little railway carriage carried the shell, an enormous thing weighing 2,500 pounds. Into the breach. It was terribly important to ram it home, otherwise it would have slipped back at high elevation. On the word go from the sergeant, these 12 over 6-foot men pushed with all their might and rammed the shell into the bore. The king was very thrilled with that. Then they put the cartridge in. Lieutenant Tickner, who was in charge on that occasion, watched the gun being elevated to check the layer was absolutely correct. Gradually, the gun got to very nearly extreme elevation, somewhere about 40 degrees. Tickner suddenly turned round to salute me to say, "Gun laid, sir." And as he did so, he nearly knocked His Majesty off the mounting. His Majesty was intensely amused at this and turned round to the other officers following behind. "Apparently, I'm in the way." That caused everybody to smile. I said, "I'm awfully sorry, sir," to the king, "but I'm afraid nobody's allowed to stand on the platform while the gun is fired." Very reluctantly, the king accepted it. When all was ready, I saluted to the king. "Gun ready, sir." And His Majesty the King said, "Fire the gun, please." I immediately ordered fire, and off went the gun, taking many of his surrounding staff by such surprise that they all cut their heads and turned away, frightened of the shock. His Majesty stood as still as a statue. The gun fired with a tremendous roar and a gigantic flash.
Now, this is quite an important occasion, isn't it? And what did Cleeve think about it? Because Cleeve...
Well, he thought that was the only time a monarch had actually given a direct order for a gun to fire in battle. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's certainly what he believed.
And one thing I know is the obsequiousness to the royal family has not changed in the slightest. And Cleeve was certainly obsequious. And that in the film, what I love is if you watch the film, all the other people are meant to be cowering and covering their heads, and you can see the king, and the gun goes off, bang, and the bloke next to him is a member of staff, just completely motionless, just like the king. It's this imagined superiority of the royal family in all things. Of course, we all love them dearly, and in no way am I criticising the wonderful George V. And if you want to know more about George V, read Alexandra Churchill's book, which is dead good, isn't it, Gary? Although it's
very, very good.
Have you read it yourself, Gary?
It's very, very good.
Anyway, the king then suggests that they do night shoots at Dwyer Station. Now this was regarded as dodgy because of the flash, But they from then, and they did carried out a night shoot. This is, according to the French locals, they got a direct hit on a German troop train. Again, I'm not sure whether this is fact or whether this is just reported. They tend to talk up anything to do with the royal family, and as I understood it, they were already doing night shoots. Although this seems contradictory in the tape. This is then Cleeve. That's pretty well for us the end of the First World War with Cleeve, because they carry on shooting, but eventually they're advancing so much that sort of gun time, they haven't got the range, even they haven't got the range to keep up. And of course they haven't got the railway, because as they move into no man's land, you've got no spurs to fire from, you've got no railway line to fire from. And so that's fundamentally, the end of the war for Spur. But it's not the end of our story, is it, Gary? Because Cleeve is he becomes a professional soldier. He already is. And he gets various postings. And then he's in Singapore, I think, probably fiddling about with the guns there. And suddenly he gets an emergency call home. Now, Gary, you've looked into what happens in the Second World War, haven't you?
Yeah, I think I'll give a little bit of context. Following the war, the idea of railway-mounted guns wasn't new. The first proposition was in 1860, I think, by a gentleman called Mr. Anderson, who suggested an iron-clad railway coach. So it wasn't a new idea, but as you've mentioned, Peter, it was very, very important, the role that it played in the Great War. So after the Great War, it was taken back to the UK, and these guns were put into storage. Now, there were a lot of famous guns. Obviously, the Boche Buster gets its fame from the incident with the King, but I'm sure most people have heard of the German guns, the Big Bertha, which was not just an individual gun; it was a series of guns that were used in the siege of the Belgian forts, and is often confused with the big Paris gun of 1918, which did such a lot of damage to Paris, but was actually a different gun built by the same crap factory. So following the war, Boche Buster was put into storage, and
following the First World
War, it was put into storage, and in 1926, which if you'd allowed me to come to, you'd have realised it was the First World War, the 18-inch barrel was fitted. The gun was taken out to Salisbury Plain for testing twice in the interwar years, and subsequently the carriage was stored at the Royal Army Ordnance Corps Depot, fine body of men, at Runnington in Nottinghamshire, and the barrel was sent to Royal Arsenal at Woolwich. Now, as you mentioned, following the outbreak of the Second World War, Cleeve, who was still a serving officer, he was still a major, was recalled from the Far East in November.
Not been promoted anymore.
No, in November 1939. Now, he was recalled in November 1939, probably a good thing given subsequent events in the Far East. He would have probably ended up being a prisoner of the Japanese otherwise.
I'm not sure he'd have lasted.
No, and he was given the role of tracing the World War I mountings, and then to train in the specialised drills for handling a variety of railway mounted guns. It wasn't just the 14-inch Boche Buster. And he found Boche Buster. He was actually present when it was found. And it was taken to the railway workshops in Darlington and later reunited with the 18-inch barrel from Woolwich.
So this, when we talk about Boche Buster, that's the actual sort of train carriage. This is the fighting train carriage. And it immediately became the biggest heavy in World War II. You mentioned how heavy it was, Peter. It immediately became the biggest gun in World War II as well. And at that time, it was manned by 50 men and several specialist gunnery officers, and the complete battery of 80 men was known as the 11th Super Heavy Battery. Now, it was deployed to the Elham Valley Railway, which is near Bourne in Kent, and a large amount of work was needed to reinforce the area to take that enormous weight and to build the magazine housings. And I really like this because it is said that the military owed a debt of thanks to a stubborn gentleman called Matthew Bell for his insistence on the unnecessary tunnel being built for the railway line so as to not spoil the view from his bedroom window. But I love the idea that the tunnel that they could actually house this gun in was completely unnecessary, but this man had made such a fuss
that it was built by the original railway. Now, this railway is a disused line now between Folkestone and Canterbury, but it was ideally suited because it allowed the gun to sweep virtually the whole of the southeast corner of Kent.
That's near your holiday home, isn't it?
It is, and its sister gun, along with two other heavies, the Gladiator and Peacemaker, was issued to the Royal Marine Siege Regiment at Dover. So there was a lot of concern at this time in the Second War about invasion of that area of the coast. Boche Buster was sighted at Bourne, and it was there to support the 43rd Infantry Battalion and to blast the coastline, as well as the English Channel, had the need arisen. And on the morning...
It wasn't particularly to shoot across the channel then?
No, I think given the fact that it probably wouldn't reach the French Channel, that was more about morale. And in fact, it was used in a poster campaign, and it was described as the fearsome cross-channel monster. But the reality is, it wouldn't have hit the French coast, but it could, it could fire into the Channel. And indeed, on the morning of the 13th of February 1941, the Boche Buster fired several test rounds into the English Channel, which resulted in a large amount of damage to the local properties, despite the fact that everybody to open their windows.
You mean the blast shattered everything?
Yeah. So there were ceilings falling down and the like. So the gun was never fired in anger. And as I mentioned, it was used largely for propaganda purposes. It was removed back to Salisbury Plain in 1943, where it was used to test a new anti-concrete shell. After the war, the Boche Buster was taken to the Royal Arsenal, and it was cut up in the 1960s along with the other heavies, railway-mounted heavies. And none of the railway guns exist today, although one of the 18-inch barrels still exists, and I think in 2013 was loaned to a Dutch museum, I think, and put on display.
I saw something on the internet when I was looking for Cleeve about that. Yes, that looked interesting. So that is still about. So that's the Boche Buster. It's a fascinating story. Can we just finish with Cleeve? Cleeve eventually leaves the army after the Second World War. He retires in from 1946, and then this is a sign he's not upper class or even wealthy middle class. He spends the rest of his life as quite a famous music teacher at several prominent, it says, public schools. But he has a whole career as a concert violinist, and he's quite famous on the internet because he pioneered. Now you'll remember this instrument. He pioneered the revival of the Viola da Moray, an instrument neglected since the 18th century. I can't think why. So this is some sort of viola that he particularly and he sort of made quite a. If you look on the internet, it's quite a splash about this thing, and there's articles and things about this particular viola. He died. He lived a long life. He died on the 5th of January 1993, and he's just one of the hundreds, thousands of veterans that the War Museum interviewed. And I pay tribute to the War Museum's work and to Lynn Smith, who did the interview with Cleeve. You'll hear her if you listen to it. If you want to listen to it, then go onto the internet and type in Montagu Cleeve, no E on Montagu Cleeve, and then IWM, and it will take you to, so you can listen to the whole sort of 5-6 hours of it, 7 hours, whatever it is, 7 hours. So that's Montagu Cleeve. I've really enjoyed talking about him. I hope you've enjoyed listening to him, and I've certainly enjoyed listening to Gary. Gary, you sound lovely today.
Yeah, I'm a bit hoarse today. I do apologise, but I think it's really interesting what we can learn about a global conflict, because both wars are on a global basis, just by listening to the testimony of an individual.
Please don't use the word testimony. You've done that deliberately. You don't trust me, Matt. Interview. Testimony.
Apologies.
You bastard.
Just for the benefit of the listeners, Pete's told me on a number of occasions not to refer to the interviews as testimony.
Yes, that's why you deliberately use it. Anyway, it's been great to speak to you, Gary. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Yeah, keep safe, Peter, and to all our listeners at this difficult time, keep safe.